With just a brief moment of silence for Prince Philip and for Her Majesty the Queen of England, as we hold them not only as a symbol of unity of the English people, but also as a private family who's now grieving the loss of a marriage and a beloved husband and father. So let us pray. And as always, Benum Christ in it, I greet Christ in you and welcome you back this morning, or this day, I should say. I know we're all over the time map. So let us begin with our opening prayer. Come, O Lord, into the creche of my spirit, the interior Bethlehem of my soul, this new Eden of my heart. Take my faith, now battered and bruised, now darkened with doubt by the wicked centuries, and restore in me the innocence of your birth, born anew in every moment, that I become your Bethlehem, your house of bread, a new offering of your body in mine for all the world to feed. Amen. For those of you following in the book, our first reading comes from page 79. I believe it's right in the middle of that page there. We've been reflecting on the prodigal son, and then the poem by Thomas Merton, which recalls in the present tense the birth of Christ in Bethlehem. And so we're reflecting on that idea of incarnation. Christianity, now an old and venerable tradition, is invited to return to the innocence of this holy night, a time before the church was torn by division or marred by those who would use its transformative power for destructive ends, a time before basilicas and cathedrals signaled the political might of Christendom, when eternal peace lay sleeping under the rafters of a barn. If Christ is the new Adam, Bethlehem is the new Eden, and we, unnumbered children of the wicked centuries, now return to this little town upon the rocky hills, battered and bruised by history, darkened by doubt, and scandalized by those who have carried out atrocities in the name of innocence incarnate. Here we stand before this epiphany of Christ, a divine love overflowing from eternity into history. And this child is the embodiment of a prodigal father who comes to us now amid a noise of whispers. Inasmuch as the inner life of faith may be patterned on Luke 15, it is only because the infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke speak eloquently of God's historical inbreaking in Christ. I invite us then into our meditation this morning. Oh, our second reading today spans 79 to 80. The love of the prodigal father is poured out in the incarnation, not only as a past moment, but as an ongoing reality that touches the deepest interiority of every living thing. We call the incarnatio continua. More recently, others refer to deep incarnation. Both of these terms point to a continuum between the historical incarnation in Jesus of Nazareth and the ongoing incarnation of Christ in humanity and the wider cosmos. That is, the historical enfleshment of God in Christ reveals a radical embodiment of the divine, extending to every last atom of the cosmos. As we began to see in the previous chapter, the modern insights into evolution and cosmology richly inform our Christological doctrines. Yet there is nothing new about a cosmological vision of the incarnation. On the contrary, the overly anthropocentric view of Christianity that has dominated Christian theology since the Enlightenment has eclipsed this more ancient cosmic Christology to which both the scriptures and early fathers attest. And we turn now to these witnesses. Of course, we will turn to them a week from now, but in the book we turn now. So let's begin. Let's close then with our closing prayer for today. I pray, O Lord, that I may become your prodigal son, your prodigal daughter, extravagant in mercy, excessive in kindness, profuse in love, reckless in compassion, uncontrolled in joy. Amen. So that brings us to that lovely time when I open the floor and get to hear your thoughts and comments and questions. Hi there. Good morning, Christine.
Good morning. Well, my reflection this morning is really part of the assignment for this last week. And I went to, as you know, a very tumultuous time. And I felt that the Lord came to me, picked me up, held me, and placed me in his heart. And I felt that I've been carried by him now for quite a while. And it's almost as though he were pregnant with me. And I'm being transformed, given new eyes, new heart, a new way of being and seeing things. And what I love about that is that I'm not doing anything other than just resting in him. And it feels like a new incarnation, as this second paragraph, the second reading spoke to that.
Christine, thanks for that. It's interesting. I never heard of it put that way, that you feel he's pregnant with you. That's a beautiful metaphor. How does Christ give birth to us? Huh? interesting in the moment. Thank you for that. And we may well come back to that in our conversation today about the practice that we were looking at this past week. So thank you for getting us going on that. Carol, please.
So I like in the second reading where it says that we became so I can't ever say the word anthropo, where we made God a human being.
Right.
So, because that's what trips me up in Christianity is all of these human qualities that, like my spiritual director gets frustrated with me because verses like ask and you shall receive trip me up because it's not true. And she wants me to have this personal relationship with a kindly grandfather, I think. You know what I mean? So that's why I think I'm gravitate towards centering prayer. And I'm anxious to keep reading the future about what you said, the early witnesses, how they saw God in a much bigger frame rather than a kindly, good human, a benevolent dictator. Right. Yeah.
Right. Well, Carol, just to point of fact, so the this tripping up. Well, first of all, if we look at this anthropocentric idea, I saw or listened to rather a wonderful paper some years ago at an academic conference, and I think we accidentally have a share screen. I'm just going to go ahead and try to. Thank you, Robert. I appreciate that. I heard a wonderful paper in which the scholar who I was listening to talked about basically the hymnody of the church, both before and after the Enlightenment, and did a study on how, based on just our hymnody, how we had shifted in the Enlightenment to a much more anthropocentric versus the older hymns, which were much more cosmologically oriented. And that's a product to some degree of humanity putting themselves front and center at the time of the Enlightenment with our rationalism, and all of that just gets reflected in how Christianity then understands. And it's an easy slip because it's a tradition that, speaks about God made human, right? So it takes a little more effort to broaden that category and to look at the scriptural text that would broaden the category from human to something like in John's gospel, flesh, right? Enfleshment. But when we look at, as we'll see in the coming pages, which for us means the coming weeks, we'll see how the early church really had a very different understanding of that, a much more cosmological understanding, which now we think we're reclaiming in ideas like the cosmic Christ, or rather inventing, but we're really reclaiming a new language. What was the older language of the church, right? Starting with the New Testament hymn, for example, to Christ we see in Colossians or in Ephesians, which both carry these intimations. So yeah, we'll continue on that trajectory for sure. And I'm blanking. What was your second your second comment then in that I wanted to offer a response?
The ask and you shall receive, is that it? No, those verses.
Oh yeah, that how you get tripped up on these things. Yeah, I mean, I think those types of questions, ask and you shall receive, and the the experience very often of that not being true. Whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. It's like, well, actually, no, that my experience is such that's not necessary.
Everybody prays to be healed of cancer. Everybody prays, and just the idea, the concept that there's a God whose mind can be changed by the number of people that pray. That sets, that doesn't set well with me. That's like saying, well, if you have a lot of friends or you belong to a church community, they're going to pray, and God, who was going to let you die, all of a sudden decides not. I mean, I just don't want to. That's the kind of God that the evangelical world created for me that I don't like, that I repulse from, or rather, go on. I'd rather hear you talk.
No, Carol, no, you're saying it very. I mean, I'm somewhat scandalized by those same ideas, right? And as we, as a community, as a globe, as an era in history, explore what we mean by an immanent God rather than merely a transcendent God, I think we do have to explore passages like that and say, how is it that they can continue to speak in a meaningful way when in fact all the points you're raising can be evidenced throughout history, and to the point of being a scandal on some level to what it means for God to answer prayer. And there tends to be this sort of easy way out when God doesn't do what we ask, to claim, well, then God has, a deeper plan and so on, which is fine. But then again, it circles back to the question, but you said, if I pray for something in your name, it will be given. So
Thank you. That's exactly right.
Right. And so it does become problematic to ask, what does intercessory prayer look like in the modern world? What is its place? What is its purpose? How can we rely on it or trust in it? And how does centering prayer provide a way into an understanding of prayer that is not what you were given? And I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but I do feel the theological concern, particularly not merely as an academic question, frankly, but particularly as a pastoral question, when I'm confronted with parishioners whose loved ones died of cancer and say, why didn't God hear my prayer when he said he would? And so what I don't know what to say to that, right? This is a scandal to that idea. So where does the prayer of letting go, the prayer of that leads us to transformation? I heard something many years ago, and I don't know the source of it, but the idea went something like, prayer doesn't change things, prayer changes people, and people change things. And there's something about that strikes me as being just more true, that prayer is not about getting things or getting God to change God's mind or so forth, right? But the transformation that makes me much more aware and conscious that if we're going to pray, feed the poor, that I understand in my own transformed sense of being a member of Christ's body, that it's these hands that are going to do it, or it's not going to happen. So that God becomes, in a sense, dependent on us in a weird theological way, despite how scandalous that might sound, to be those hands, to be those ears and eyes and so on, in order for the very prayers we have to be answered, right? We become that. And in my last chapter of Becoming Prayer, in a sense, I allude to these types of ideas. We become the answer to other people's prayers in our transformed lives. And I think that that's worthy of some exploration in a world that's scandalized by too many prayers that seem to go unanswered otherwise.
And beautifully said. That's what I think the ultimate prayer is, just transform me, into your son. So,
right.
And then, to be Christ in the world, like you said, in every atom.
Yeah. I think too, and then I'll take some of the comments that are coming up on the chat. I think too, there is still a value in intercessory prayer, particularly when it's communal based. I love how some of the churches say that, in our so-called prayer of the faithful or bidding prayer, it is still Christ in us crying out to the Father, as it were, for the needs of humanity. And I think there's an emotional, psychological component to that in itself is healing and nourishing, to be able to go to God with what our deep concerns really are, to what our deepest needs are. And it's why, however, that whenever we have our intercessory prayer at St. Columba's, I have written a prayer that always concludes that. And it goes something to the effect of, that God hear all the prayers that have been spoken, all those we hold in the silence of our hearts, and those for which we have yet to find words. For you know better than we the deepest needs of our hearts. So there is always that openness to the prayer, the unspoken, the unthought, the unrealized prayers that really become in many ways the deepest prayers, because those are the ones in which we simply are giving ourselves over without even necessarily having words, and it's giving ourselves over to that transformation, right? So thank you for that very honest concern. And there are many theologians, and I think perhaps even more so priests and deacons and people in ministry, who are more and ever more deeply concerned with those very questions, because it's hard to face a mother who lost her child and says, why didn't God hear this prayer? Right? It's a very painful thing to have to address. Yeah. Penny, please.
I'm going back to your lovely prayer at the beginning, since we're talking about prayer. And one of the images that struck me is this idea of us fresh. I think the language is into the creche of my spirit. And so I was spending time thinking about this image of the creche. And I am watching right now a mother bird sitting on the nest in my patio, junco, and she's got 4 eggs in there. And this sheltering image of the feminine aspect of God, which is nurturing life. And I see this image of the prodigal father as also connected with some imagery in the Old Testament of a God sheltering his children under her wings. And it's feminine language of this sheltering and nurturing aspect of God. And so the connection I'm making here, first of all, as I look at this little bird faithfully sitting every day on this nest, it's this aspect of creation of the universe where life is being born, but it requires a nest. Mm-hmm. And so your prayer about make us a creche, a place where something can be born, is very, very powerful to me at this moment, because I see this life instinct that to allow Christ to be born in us is to experience us being hospitable to the presence of this life-giving, sheltering power, the warmth of the mother bird on the nest, but it requires a nest. And if we are the nest, where something, it goes back to Christine's image of Christ being pregnant with us, we also are the place where life comes to birth. And so one of the things I'm thinking of is this amazing image in the Angelus, which I always relate to very strongly, and it's particularly appropriate this morning, is Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. That connection between the life-giving and nurturing into life and nurturing into death is this very strong archetypal image of the feminine, which is in all of us. So that's what was triggered by me, by your prayer about help us be a nest, help us be a creche, a place where Christ can be born.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Penny, I think that your speaker might have been a bit delayed there, but I just got everything you said. So thank you. It's absolutely beautiful. I think too, and we'll explore this later, the idea of the shadow of God's wings is a particularly poignant image in my own spiritual life. Psalm 57:1, shelter me in the shadow of your wings until the storms of destruction pass. It's a poignant time in our history to be looking at that question of the sheltering wings of the divine, and the idea of God as shadow, not just light, right? The mystery of unknowing rather than just bright light and so forth. But I think that part of what you're pointing to also is prayer as abandonment. And I think one of the things that speaks to me about the cross is that it speaks of a God who isn't just going to fix our problems, or who is, what I say in the book, emperor of the universe, but is crucified love. That if you want to know where is God in suffering, it's in the midst of our suffering. And I think that's a great point of revelation for Christianity, that God is in the midst of suffering and God abides in the midst of suffering. And that's so important, because it does offer within Christianity a counterpoint to the God who would simply give us what we want, or respond to our prayers and what we say we think we want, and so on, or is necessarily even has the power that could transform our every whim and wish into a realized, reality. It opens up questions about what it means to say God is all powerful, which for me means all loving. And that, I think, gets spilled over in the cross into history, that abiding with, as the ultimate answer to all of our prayers, really. Thank you for that comment on the shadow. Yeah. Joanne, Carl, are you trying to raise your hand?
I am. The raise hand function is not working on this
Okay, got
computer.
it.
And I just wanted to say that I found the opening prayer so beautiful and so deeply insightful that I wish you would post the text in the chat so that we could have it. I think that maybe what God's greatest gift to us might be the receptivity, which is the creche. So that you could translate, ask and ye shall be given, to ask and ye shall be receptive. That you can receive and therefore become that nest, become that receptivity that is the sheltering of the ongoing incarnation.
Yeah, well, Carl, thank you. I'll post that momentarily, and of course, Joanne is going to have this afterward. And she could post it to those of you who are in the email list. If you're not, Carl, and you want to just tag Joanne Kame with your email, she can add you to that list. You can send her a private chat right now. And Carl, to your point, I tried to, in a way, it's interesting you would pick that up, because I actually tried to move in that direction in the closing prayer, right? To become the prodigal son in that sense, so that we can have that. Somebody wrote in the comments about the sort of the strangeness, maybe, or the surprise of referring to the prodigal, which typically means wasteful, extravagant, luxurious, right, to God in this case. But what I talk about in the book is that what I love the notion of the prodigal father, because really it is that extravagant, excessive, profuse, right, reckless love that he has for his children, that unbound love, really, that I think is at the heart of the story. And in a way, in the closing prayer, tried to move precisely to that point that you noticed. So thank you for that. Let me go ahead then and quickly, while I have a moment, then, for those of you who are not on the list, and screen share the. I think the formatting got a little messed up there, but there's that prayer, Carl, and anybody who would want it. Joanne, I'll be forwarding that to you just after today. Okay. So other thoughts or comments today? Christine, please.
Father Vincent, I wonder if you might put words around how powerful the love of God is. I think that's something we really need to grasp in a way that makes sense in such a world where we see power as violent and dominating. So could you please?
Yeah, so I can give you what I think is a simple, maybe overly simplistic metaphor, but it would maybe be my elevator speech on the power of God's love. Because I think it does help, just again, provide a possible framing for what we mean. So I'm always drawn to that beautiful passage in Corinthians. There are three things that last: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these are love. So if we kind of start with that scriptural text, which attests to love as really the only lasting and eternal power, and that everything else we think of as love as power doesn't last and therefore isn't real power, whether that's the power of governments or militaries or regimes or money or civilizations, or frankly, the sun, the power of, all of it comes to an end. All of it eventually dies, right? Empires come and go, civilizations, species, planets, stars, solar systems come and go. So ultimately, none of those things are equated with what we really mean by power, by real power. And what persists is love through it all. And what holds it in existence is love. But it strikes me that the power of love is, as the incarnation would, I think, testify, is a self-emptying power, a self-giving power, not a power to control, not a power to manipulate, so the example I give, and I think, pardon me, but I think I gave this example recently of the power of a mother who loves her child, who say has an illness, the flu, and left abandoned, that child would likely die of the flu. The mother, for all her love, cannot assume onto herself that flu and literally unburden her child with it. That's not what the power of love is capable of doing. But what she can do is to nurture and to feed and to be with and to comfort and to medicate the child back to health. So in a sense, it is that power of love that employs or is expressed through these acts of giving and care that ultimately bring the child back to health. Not in a way that we might want for God to remove or take away our problems, restore my health or take away this crisis or change the outcome of this event, but rather through, like the mother, this abiding sense that in the love of God, God continues to provide. And whether it's this side of the veil or the next, there is a trust that God abides, that love will win, that power of persistent, abiding presence will ultimately prevail. And then the task becomes trusting it. When Jesus says, be like these little children, he's referring to their sense of powerlessness and trust in their parents, right? Not so much as we might think today as innocence, as much as powerlessness. So he's saying you have to just trust in this ultimate goodness that will prevail. And I think that there's lots of sort of philosophical reasons why we have to talk about living in a world where terrible things happen. And mostly the go-to responses for freedom needs to be the basis of any relationship of love, right? I can't require you to love me, or it's not love. It has to be born of a free choice, of a free will, as it were. And so with that comes a universe in which we can say no to that love, and often do, and with all the consequences thereof, right? So in a sense, the cross again comes to speak of a God whose love abides. And I think then when we think of power, if it isn't love, then it's not power. So when we think of God changing or doing or manipulating or intervening and so on, I don't necessarily have an answer to the big picture of that, because it's a mystery to me what that really looks like. But there is a sense in which I believe that the cross is this profoundly deep revelation. The incarnation, maybe more broadly, is a deep revelation that God is love and that love does abide. And at the end of the day, that can be trusted, no matter what, right?
Yes, and what comes to mind as you speak is the power of love to transform and change lives. And Greg Boyle talks about this all the time, that what changes these gangsters, these people of gangs, is tenderness and being loved. That's the transformative power.
Absolutely. And notice that is not a microwave, fast fix, instant solution. It's the kind of love that it requires the building of trust and friendship and communication and understanding and all the things that transform us, right? And I think we have to not underestimate that. So in other words, when we hear the term God is all powerful, it can only mean God is all loving. In my mind, that's because, right? And any other thing that we associate with power is really just it ultimately falls short of that, right? And so there are real consequences to decisions I make, to mistakes I make, to accidents that happen by nobody's fault, right? Natural disasters, that's the world we live in. God has promised to abide in and through that, and we trust in that. Is there something wrong then in voicing our prayer, God heal me, or this loved one? No, because I think there is a deep way in which we are revealing our deepest desires and our deepest needs. But we have to understand as we pray that what the power of love is and does, and what it doesn't do. Right. And to go back to Carol's point, anything other than that just feels like, wait a minute, like you're asking me to believe something that evidence does not supply any foundation for. So what do I do, right? What do I do with that then? How do I talk to that mother who lost her child to cancer? What do I say in that case? God ignored you. God didn't answer your prayer. How do you address those tragedies? If God can change and refuses to or doesn't, what does that mean then, right? I remember a good friend of mine who's an Episcopal priest says, when we're praying for what really are small, in the grand scheme of things, petty issues, help me through this problem or help me get through this day. He said, well, if God didn't come to the rescue of 11 million people in the Holocaust, why do you think he's going to fix your problems today? I mean, it's a real question. It's a real question. We have to, I think, then really, that's where I think the cross really speaks to us. But Jesus had a prayer too, right? Take this cup from me, right? Why have you forsaken me? All of that was met with silence and silence and silence, nothing but silence and death. And then comes resurrection. But you see, it's sometimes not in the frame that we're asking our prayer to be. He didn't say, let this pass after I'm crucified. His prayer was now, before this happens. Don't make me have to go through this. But then comes that acquiescence, but not my will, but yours be done. And in many ways, that is, I think, the ultimate prayer of all of us, difficult as that is. Yeah. Richard, sorry for the wait. And then Mary, I see your hand, please.
Very candid conversation. My prayer is that I try not to be clever and speak something from heart. I was recording at the turn of the century a New Thought church group, and the market had just crashed and people weren't coming to the event, and oh, woe was us. And this minister stood up and said, nothing real changed. Nothing real changed. Love is still love.
Mm-hmm.
And it reframed my thinking about on what I was dependent and what really is cosmological Christ incarnating this moment. And we, in our limited life, the prodigal was sent out to experience and come back full of the experience of everything, and grew and helped God to grow. The innocent angel doesn't have our experience, and our experiences bring us an expansion of what's never been. We are each uniquely and brand new, expanding, and thus God expands. The archetype is affected by the exemplar as one frame, but as I experience, God grows. So there's a trust possible that being sent out and feeling lost and learning and bringing back to the garden is is the design.
Mm.
It is a plan beyond my ken, and it's perfect. Yet I don't know it when it hurts. And yet I'm grateful for the hurts in my life, for they opened me most.
Mm-hmm.
And when my sister was dying of cancer, long ago now, 1982, no, 1974, and I met a teacher from India and asked, could my sister's life be spared? He said, that can be accomplished. Do you want to change God's plan for your sister's soul? And I didn't know there was a plan. I didn't know that that there was a God at that time. But in that moment, I learned to trust, and I learned that I'm not in charge of all, and that I can't fix it all. But there's a divine plan. And in that trust, I melted and opened. So that's my comment for the moment.
Thank you, Richard. And I think that speaks to what can often pass as prayer as really a desire to conform God's will to ours. I mean, I just think that it's very difficult to understand that within the context of a suffering loved one who lost someone but yet this particular man who spoke to you, I think, spoke rightly, or at least raised a very legitimate question that can confront all of us at some point. Yeah. Thank you for that comment. Mary, please.
Good morning.
Hi.
So Father Vincent, I heard you a couple of times, not today, but today was one time, say that you were talking about the mother and the child, and the mother not being able to take on the illness of a child, but could pray for the child. And I just wanted to offer another perspective, which is what comes to my mind is Ellen Bernstein's movie on resurrection. I do feel that there are people who have developed their spiritual power, if you want to call it that, to such a degree that really can take on the illness of other people and be a vehicle for healing in that capacity. So I just wanted to offer that as another way of thinking about healing.
Yeah, beautiful, Mary. I'm unaware of that, but I'll take a look at that film. That sounds fascinating. Yeah, and my point was even not so much that the mother could pray, but could actually become prayer, could do the life, could intervene with life-saving measures for the child, and that is her love bringing that child to a place of healing, is what I was saying, rather than what would happen if she just like left the child in her illness, what that would mean. So, but this is you're introducing even a deeper concept there of that spiritual capacity to take on. So that's fascinating. I presume the movie you mentioned refers to this. Yes. Yeah.
It's Ellen Bernstein's Resurrection.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay, Nora, please. Nora, are you there? I'm not
Yes,
sure.
I am.
Okay, go right ahead.
I am. Good morning, Father. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm not wanting to go to gender issue as such, but I loved Penny's idea of the feminine in all of us. And I think that we are faced with the contrast in our world of the militaristic society that surrounds us and the idea of power over, as opposed to the energy of love and what that means. And I heard a very interesting podcast this week, Brene Brown interviewing Ellen Lesser. And Ellen Lesser has written a book called The Voice of Cassandra. And she makes a point that's been floating in my mind since I heard it. And that is that in the 30s, the idea of the research, psychological research that was done, that came up with the notion of fight or flight as a reaction of fear. And Ellen Lesser mentioned a researcher, a more recent researcher, who talks about the feminine spirit of tending and befriending. And I think Penny's example of the mother junco bird nesting is just such a vivid example of that. And this researcher who comes up with the words tend and befriend is the spirit of the feminine that we all have, as Penny said, that we all have. But it is that spirit that we need to tend and befriend, to oppose the exact opposite of the militaristic. And I'm reading now for a class I'm in, the Martin Luther King speech on opposing the Vietnam War. And what a brave decision he made to come, and he had to do it. He says very clearly, his conscience made him do it. He braced himself and faced that militaristic power over, if you will. So I just wanted to bring out the idea of the feminine in all of us, and that is what we need to nurture the love. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Nora. I appreciate your comments. Beautiful. Yeah, you're right. His speech at the time was both relevant and, challenging, right? This is a very volatile time.
I just wanted to add that he suffered. There's a documentary now that he suffered. It was done exactly the day, a year before he was killed, to the day, that Riverside Church speech. And a year later, he was dead. But that last year of Martin Luther King's life, he had grave depression, serious depression from all the rejection that he got from this stance that his conscience made him take. He had no choice. So it wasn't an easy task.
I heard once, if you're not alone, you're not trailblazing. And that would strike me as being the case in that instance, right? He was ahead of his time, and there were others like him who were doing similar work, but the general response was indeed, the society wasn't ready to hear it, as is the case with most prophets, which is why we tend to kill them. They say things we don't want to hear, and it's just easier to do away with them. Thank you, Nora. Other thoughts or questions? Or do we maybe perhaps look at practice? Are we ready to move to practice? Okay, let me call that up so I can show that to you.
While you're calling that up, I just wanted to say that you're coming to speak to our group on May 15th.
Yes, I am. That's right.
I'll try to behave myself.
Please do. Don't embarrass me, Carol. All right. Okay, so before we move into that, Gerald, sorry, I see your hand up. Did you want to talk about the practice or content from the reading?
Today's general discussion, Father,
Sure, go right ahead.
And just a thought. So much of what I heard reminds me of I'm afraid down deep what each of us is looking for is something very rosy. We want all the pain and the suffering and the illness to just miraculously disappear. And I do too. But on the other hand, I think we forget the crucifix, not the cross. We're all very good about waving the cross around, but we forget that's a crucifix. That Jesus hung there, humiliated, probably naked, as was the Roman practice, suffering tremendously, physically and emotionally. And he asks that we take up his cross. And we don't want that naturally. No one wants that. But I'm afraid that's a fact of life that we lose sight of. And down deep in so many of our prayers, we're looking for that rosiness. And I think at some point we have to accept, we have to accept the cross, the crucifix. Are we going to follow Jesus or aren't we? And as much as he didn't want to suffer, he accepted it. And I'm not sure, am I making any sense?
You are. I think we are, clearly we live in a world in which suffering is real, in which we can't wish it away or pray it away, in which some of it feels completely meaningless, other types of suffering perhaps redemptive, some just seems cruel and wasteful. But it's a reality regardless of what kind of suffering we're dealing with. And indeed it does typically, I think for the most part, have the capacity or the seed or the invitation to transform us. And even then, I have experienced a lot of suffering in people that feels not like something they could completely overcome, but just something that through which they learn to live and to deepen their lives and their sense of compassion, but not the suffering that will ever be healed or go away, perhaps because it's too formative or too traumatic. So we have to learn to live with suffering without that becoming, without succumbing to the idea that that is the end all and be all, or that is the ultimate word in life or death. But in many ways, it's as much a mystery as anything in life. Why is there suffering, and how does this benevolent, loving God of ours allow it? It's a huge, ongoing theological question. But nevertheless, it's there, I think, Gerald, to your point, and it's up to us to learn how to live with it and to live through it in a way that becomes life-giving and not merely death-dealing. Thank you for that. Let's take a look then at our practice for this coming week, and then we'll look at practice from that was given last week. So for this coming week, Bethlehem means house of bread. I'm not sure if you knew that. It is the birthplace of the one who became bread for us. So the question then becomes a meditation on how are we called to be a new Bethlehem, or perhaps more directly, for whom are you bread? For whom are you bread? Nourishment, sustenance, And how do we become houses of bread that others may feed on? Hunger of all of its types, spiritual hunger, physical hunger, is part of the human condition. And so feeding that hunger, physical or otherwise, I think is part of a loving response of God. Give us this day our daily bread is more than a prayer for simply food, but for all that sustains us, symbolized by that bread. So how do we become that for others? How do you in your own life see that? So again, I'll be sending this to Joanne to send out. But let me look then to last week's practice. So maybe a discussion. Our encounter with the mystical Christ is not always fully or immediately obvious to us. For Christ to rise in us, he must first be born in us. So I asked for you to meditate on how Christ is slowly being born in you. What intimations, what shifts in awareness, what experiences or insights have led you to recognize that is Christ in me, or here is Christ present. And just to make the full connection, I am trying to build on this practice in what I offered you for this coming week, so that what I'm asking us to reflect on now, based on our practice from this past week, is how is this awareness of Christ manifest in me? How do I recognize it? Which is an important step to knowing how I can become the bread of Christ for others, how I can become that spiritual nourishment for others. So these two I see as somewhat one following after the other. So I'm going to put the screen down, and we can sit in silence with this for a bit, or open it up to discussion if anybody would like to share your thoughts on this meditation. Mary, please.
I am trying to look at suffering and events that happen with new eyes. And this came after reading something in Evelyn Underhill Hill's book on mysticism. And this week I became aware of the welcoming prayer, and going at a much deeper level about what the welcoming prayer really means for me. And in that, what it means is to really be able to see what goes on, whatever it is, with a transcendent lens of being able to see things that happen with, I hesitate to use the word beauty, but in fact, that's what came to me, is that there is an element of something that we can't see as beautiful in situations. So that's what happened to me this week.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, I was talking with somebody this week here on the grounds of St. Columba's, and we were talking about, suffering and beauty. It occurred to me as we were looking out over this beautiful Tamales Bay that really just sort of is up against our property here, recognizing that it is in fact the San Andreas fault line that runs directly underneath it. I mean, I could pretty much throw a stone to it from where I'm sitting right now. And that is the fault line that was, of course, responsible for the devastating earthquake in 1906 and many, many before that. And they say it's a 100-year fault line. So we're a little past due for the next big one from the San Andreas, insofar as that's at all true. But what occurred to me is, in all of that violence and destruction, it is also what accounts for the beauty of this part of the world. The shape of the hills and the terrain and what grows here is all related to these sometimes violent upheavals that are capable of incalculable damage and destruction. And yet over the course of time, that those violent, acts that basically shake everything to the ground have also shaped what is almost unparalleled beauty in some senses of this part of the world. And so there's this connection between that suffering and violence and the beauty of, one could make that case with probably most parts of the world, depending on how long of a geological timeline you want to look at. But when you look at the Hawaiian Islands, for example, and those devastating volcanic eruptions, but the beauty is just striking. That also emerges from that. So isn't there a metaphor potentially for those things that either violently or suddenly or unexpectedly tear us asunder and cause tremendous suffering, also become sources of profound beauty, right? Wounds that heal, as it were. I think there, in that big book of scripture that we call creation, I think there is that message, right? That keeps spilling over. In terms of that relationship between destruction and beauty, or between suffering and beauty, and and violence and beauty, there's something there. Yeah. So thank you for that. Pat, please.
I have been finding myself more and more reacting to circumstances and other people in life in ways of more compassion, less judgment, less anger. And I think this is how Christ is starting to manifest himself in me. And sometimes this will happen, I'll think, like, who was that? Who just reacted that way? It's just, becomes so transforming, so different for me.
Mm.
And even
Thank
looking
you.
at political things of, the polarization in the country, and, disagreeing with many, but trying to have some compassion as to why someone is coming from such a different and often hateful viewpoint, and what was it in their lives that put them in that place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's a very, very good reflection, because it gets us beyond the veneer of our anger or even our repulsion at what might feel like a completely diametrically opposed ideological view that we find actually offensive or to some degree. And it gets us beyond all of that separates us from that other human being into the place of what's beneath that in terms of woundedness or history, or that leads to these different viewpoints, right, that we share. It's a beautiful way to reflect beyond that. Yeah. Carl, by the way, thank you for that comment. I wrote down the name Arthur Quinn. I'll have a look at that. I appreciate you putting that out there. Thanks. Barbara, please. Barb, you're muted. You disappeared there. I'm not even sure where you are right now.
There she is.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
I just wanted to thank Gerald too, because he made me realize the real difference between the cross and the crucifix, and that changed everything for me. I really always felt that God was with me in pain and suffering, but when I thought about the extent of the crucifix and what that really meant, it just brought some comfort. And I think of the times that I've had my pain and discomforts have been the times that I grew closest to, or God grew closest to me. I allowed him to come closer to me.
Mm.
And I realized how that has changed my life and brought such peace and joy, to know how much I am loved and that I am dear to him, as we all are dear to him. And so I just wanted to thank this group for all that they say, and for you, Father. And it means so much to all of us to be able to hear everyone's viewpoint, which enriches and enlarges our own. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Barbara. And I agree. So often I hear such beautiful ways to speak or metaphorize or allegorize something from members of the group that really does a lot of theology is just about reframing what we think and seeing it beyond in a view that we hadn't been shown before, and how that can really take a whole trajectory or a tradition or line of thought and suddenly put it in a completely different light. And that can really be groundbreaking for our own spiritual journey, to realize we've been held back by limited or sometimes even false conceptions, and can really be free to move past those stumbling blocks just by a simple word or phrase that somebody uses that says, oh, wow, I hadn't thought of it like that before. And that gives me a whole new avenue into that mystery. So thank you for acknowledging that. I appreciate it, and I share it with you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Nicola, please.
Well, I've been working with the welcoming prayer. And prior to that, I had been able to look at my life and realize that it was through my personal pain that I grew, and that those were the blessings in my life, even though at the time they felt like tragedies to me. And even though I could look at that and say that about the challenges, I knew that that was, an irritating idea to most people, that the pursuit of happiness and the avoidance of pain is something that we're all, it's in our DNA, apparently. And yet when I started working with the welcoming prayer, and I'm still very new at this, I realized that by welcoming the pain or the anxiety or whatever it was, that I was confronting my fear and my avoidance. And in the moment of that, I am starting to understand what courage actually is. And I'm not there by any means. I'm nervous now, but that is very liberating to realize that it's the avoidance of pain, that's where I've been feeding my energy all my life, really. And that the freedom comes from turning and staring that down, whatever that may look like in that moment.
Yeah. No, that is profoundly insightful, and I hope many of us kind of come to that same place. There is a very different posture in how we live if it is one that is merely trying to avoid pain or suffering, versus one that just is open to life and what comes, and receives or accepts with all the joy and goodness and beauty the suffering that is simply a part of life, and how that transforms us. I open every morning. I have an extended sort of prayer that leads me into my meditation, but it opens up basically with a prayer that says, "I abandon myself to you. Do with me as you will." And of course, that abandonment is always imperfect. It's a prayer that I can abandon, by repeating every day the desire to abandon myself to the will of God. It helps make it so. And do with me as you will. For years and years and years, every time I prayed that, I did so with a kind of trepidation, like, oh God, what's he gonna bring on me today that I'm agreeing to assent to? And am I gonna regret this prayer by 1 o'clock this afternoon? But the interesting piece is that it just like you know what you shared, Nicola, in your sort of shifts, one day kind of happened to me. I thought, why am I praying this with trepidation? Why is there not the implicit assumption that what God will bring is joy and light and beauty and transformation? Sometimes that may be packaged in some suffering, but that it made me realize that there was this constant trepidation I had around, when is the other shoe going to drop in my life, right? I think, like Carol, I think I'm a 6 on the Enneagram, which is a recent discovery in myself. Because for years, I'm like, am I a 2? Am I a 4? Like, nobody could figure it out. I think I'm a 6, actually. But in any case, so there is that propensity to be like, oh, there's danger everywhere, right? And so forth. So, but that transformation that you just described was really an opening up for me to say, no, this is abandoning myself to a loving God, a trusting God, right? A God who wishes and desires and wills beauty and joy and transformation. I don't pray that with trepidation anymore. I pray that with a sense of joy, an openness to what God will bring. And then when there is suffering, it has helped me to reframe that in a way that this is part of a bigger, still optimistic, still hopeful picture of divine love. Yeah. So thank you for that, Nicola. I share that shift, and I'm glad I'm not the only one who's had the beauty of that transformed sort of view. Okay, Carol, my number 6 on the screen here.
Yes, the 6s unite. Jennifer and Carmen. Yeah, definitely. And so, Nicola, I definitely, appreciate what you said, because the welcoming prayer is courageous, and it is helpful especially for 6s to say, I'm going to collaborate with you, God. And I always think about, that's why I love St. Teresa. Remember, she was drowning and she cried out to God and said, help me. And he said, God answered, don't you know this is how I treat my friends? And her answer was, this is why you have so few of them. Right. But I always think your prayer is very courageous, because I'm the same way, where I want to abandon myself, but I know what happens to people that abandon. But then we're back to Gerald and the crucifixion. And so back to your meditation, in order for Christ to be born in me, it's like that seed that has to die. In order for him to be born, I really have to die, right. And so I have to, and then we get back to that true self, false self again, where I'm really, the false self is dying, but the true self was already baptized and united with Christ. So that's what I'm trying to collaborate with God on, to let that self die so that Christ can live within me. So, I think it's a beautiful, the birth, the death, and, I hate to say it, but that's why I wrote in the chat to you, birth is violent. And, it can be very violent. And until about 100 years ago, women died in childbirth all the time. Mm-hmm. So, when you think about that, you just think, wow, something so beautiful and tragic at the same time. So it's sort of the same thing. Our life dies, Christ lives within us, which is what we ultimately want. So thank you. Yeah, 6s unite.
Yes, that's right. Well, Carol, to your point, I think I mean, when we read the book of Revelation, which on some levels is the most violent text of the New Testament, or at least its attestation to violence, talks about the end times as birth pangs to a new beginning, a new Israel, a new Jerusalem. So there is this definite association, to your point, with violence and the violence of being, also giving birth to something new, a new world order. The old world order is not going to go down easily. It's not going to go down without a fight. But the suffering we experience in the process is birth pangs, and that's a hopeful way of understanding suffering, right? For what that's worth, the fruitfulness of suffering.
And watching the institutional church crumbling now in our generation, but there's something new and better, like this group. I mean, this is, many of us come from churches where we would never be able to speak like this. You know what I mean? People would have looked at us and said, what, there's something wrong with you. Why don't you just accept, that everything is good and wonderful and we're all here to, and so I think we found each other that the walk with Jesus is a struggle, like it was for Jesus. So, and we found compatriots for the journey. So
yeah, and companions are those who share bread with one another. Panos, being right. So we share this bread. We become bread. We nurture each other as bread. In a sense, we become Christ, and this becomes both deeply contemplative but profoundly countercultural, and at a time when we are sure to continue to face social upheavals, ecological disaster, as we move ever more toward the brink of what climate change is indeed bringing on us. I think these countercultural communities in which we can in one hand support one another in and through these changes that are coming, and not do so in a way that we all become communes turned in on ourselves, but examples to the world, a welcoming example to those who want to be more collaborative versus competitive and so on, as resources maybe are being more fought over. As we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, shelves being emptied, right? I mean, we're all going to see these moments again in our lives. So how do we build more collaborative communities grounded in the awareness that we are extensions of Christ's body, extensions of one another, Christ and bread for one another, rather than just go with that cultural flow of everyone for themselves, right? Which just makes everything worse in the end. Yeah. So thank you, Carol. Pat, and then Sue, please.
This discussion brings to mind to me also the concept of societal suffering and what do we do with that. I think there's been, basically maybe three approaches. Either that's just the way life is and be rather nonchalant about it, or, how do we as individuals or corporately address that injustice? But also in the church, there's been almost a sense of complicity, whether it's during the times of slavery, where the Bible was used to justify slavery, or the Christian, segments of the Christian church becoming like politically nationalized, or the evangelical church in how it has approached and treated the marginalized. I don't know a solution here, but I just see that there's, there is societal suffering to be addressed and dealt with, and how maybe we have, people have been anthropocentric about the church to justify that societal suffering.
Yes. So, and the church, I think that's why the church is in constant need of interior reform to address new situations, to be able to examine itself and its role in history. I do think that we're more and more aware of sort of historical trauma that entire people or tribes or ethnicities have experienced at the hands of others, or at the hands of various institutions and so on. And as we're learning about this, it gets beyond the, just think about, how when my dad was growing up, for example, how he loved, movies about cowboys and Indians, in the Wild West. I mean, think about how racist and offensive that is now. Looking back, it was just the Indians were the bad guys. There was no question about that. And when you really look at our history, it is just alarming that nobody really was questioning the portrayal of the Native Americans of this country in Hollywood culture. I mean, it's shocking on some level now looking back. As we begin to deconstruct the ways in which we've been taught to think about these kinds of relations, or who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, as it were, it is hard work. And we feel sometimes very reactive toward it because we don't want to be the bad guy, or we don't want our ancestors to be the bad guy, or our church institution to have engaged in things that we find morally offensive today. But part of the hard work of not repeating that, and of growing and of really embodying the kingdom now, is to do that very, very hard work of introspection, and not to, by contrast, oversimplify history, rewrite history, make it all. a construct of a different good and bad guy and sort of just switch the roles around. I mean, people are people, and these institutions worked in collaboration often, and lines were not as clearly drawn as we might reconstruct them today, I think, on most issues.
Yeah, a podcast that I regularly listen to is Pass the Mic from the Black Christian Collective. And they've recently had some segments on people who have been members of predominantly white churches and have left, and saying why they have left because of having felt marginalized. And, so that I think is also part of like, how do we incorporate those who are different from us?
Mm-hmm. Yes, right, exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Pat. A quick comment before, Sue, I take your point. We see this even in the New Testament. I mean, the divides were just along different lines, but that tendency, Jews to hate Samaritans and vice versa. I mean, these are, or the bifurcation between Jew and Gentile and all of the implications around that. Holding slaves, not necessarily for based on ethnic lines, but usually political lines of which, army overcame which other, population. So all of these things were there, and within the Bible, you can see the seeds within Paul and within Christ himself, planting those seeds to overcome those, right? To incorporate and to expand our notion. In many ways, what Christianity has done is universalized the God of Israel. The God of Israel becomes the God of all the nations in the teachings of Christ, who sort of breaks down that barrier that once had been there. So it's it's a fascinating study to see how, in many ways, while the categories have changed, the tendencies haven't, and the gospel really pulls us to look beyond that. Yeah. Sue, sorry for the wait. Good to see you again.
I'm going back to the welcoming prayer discussion, if that's
Sure.
okay, and to Gerald's discussion. But how beautiful the crucifixion is for us as an example of the welcoming prayer. Christ feeling, sinking into, and then welcoming it and surrendering it to the divine indwelling, letting go of his humanity at that moment. And by the embracing, transforming, he taught us how through our own body of pain, restriction, whatever, through our own body, how to resurrect it and go back and give light into the world. By embracing and giving that moment to him as abandonment, thy will be done. Cynthia Pizzuto sort of talks about a cosmic dialysis. She talks about it sort of like, Christ took all of it in and then took it through his system and then cleaned all our humanity out and poured back out. And I like that too. Mm-hmm. So
thank you.
That was basically sort of my shift in awareness at a deeper level with the welcoming prayer.
Thank you for that, Sue. Yeah, in many ways, that the cross really does become that central figure of that invitation for us to also die to self. That the truth of who we are emerges, or who Christ is. That beautiful prayer within the Gospel of John by John the Baptist. He must grow greater, I must grow less. That there is that. The dying and the rising is a daily, ongoing, sometimes even simultaneous process within us. But that whole notion of not my will, but yours be done, that, Christ doesn't choose the cross, but chooses fidelity, abandonment to the will of God, despite the cross. And in that, comes to this place of deep and profound resurrection. So how we die to self, that we might also come to that resurrection in ourselves, I think is an urgent call to all Christians, and particularly for those of us who are striving, if you want to use that term, within the contemplative life, to ask, how is that happening within me in a given moment? Thank you for that connection to the welcoming prayer. Beautiful. Yeah. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, good morning. I don't necessarily have all the words yet, but I've so appreciated what everyone's been sharing. And I think one of the reasons I love this group and this community and your community at St. Columba's is that constant reminder to return to the interior work. Because I think for me, sort of as I, over my life, became more and more aware of injustice in both historical and current injustices, it was really easy to point a finger and to basically like fight tribalism with tribalism, and sort of be like, well, I'm on the right side of history, or I know better than these people. And a very human sort of instinct, right? I think we're sort of our false self, our consciousness is tribal. And I guess my awareness is sort of, oh, wow, I really need God to sort of be able to transcend that, to wake up to that, to nudge me into the direction of sort of going interiorly, and sort of like you've said before, sort of having a better understanding of what in me needs to die in order to give birth to Christ in the world, or how do I represent Pharaoh for different people. So I think I don't know if that makes sense, but that's sort of what's been stirring in me for the last many, many months. So I'm just grateful for you and for all of you so that we can sort of wrestle with these issues.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I think you're really speaking in terms of how we process that as a faith community, right? As a group of disciples is so important, because we have to be able to provide a space for one another to really be able to safely voice whatever that struggle looks like in us, without having that become confrontational or have that become a debate right in the moment. Because that tends to take us out of the sort of contemplative space into a more argumentative left brain, right? I'm right, you're wrong space. And I do feel that this group has done that beautifully over the last year and a half or 2 years that we've been meeting. They're really holding that space for one another, where we can sort of offer even a half-baked idea or struggling to find the words. But in that, we help speak ourselves into clarity, because there's a sort of loving and supporting group that says, well, that may not be my particular struggle, but to be honest, I've got my own, and I want to be able to share that with this group, right? In that vulnerability. So the idea is, how do we create a spacious Christianity, as it were, in which we can come as we are, and the transformation happens in the process of the intimacy of our shared relationships, rather than you have to check a certain card of doctrine at the door to be allowed in or to feel like you fit. And if you don't, you have to silence or suppress that question, which is what a lot of us have dealt with in our histories. There's just a sort of explicit or implicit assumption that you believe X, Y, and Z in this particular way. And that's that, as opposed to, I'm not sure what the cross means or what it means for God to hear prayer or whatever the case may be. But if I can find a safe place to allow the gift of that doubt or questioning to be present before other people who are also doubting and questioning, right? Then something beautiful happens. We become more deeply tethered to one another and to a tradition that now we can hear in a different way, that can inform us in a different way. So this is, it's so important that the church begin to model. In many ways at St. Columba's, I think of myself as the one who tethers the community to the tradition, because it's where I feel a conviction around the truths of the tradition. But I don't have that expectation of my congregation. What I hope is that over the years, as we build love and trust and friendship and dialogue, that they feel more deeply brought to the the nurturing qualities of the tradition, but it's never an expectation I have, or a timeline that I put people on. That's my job as the vicar, to kind of hold the tradition for everyone, and at least have people confront it or challenge it or experience it in a way that helps them embrace it more deeply. And that's, I think you're pointing to that gift of this community for one another. And with you, I'm very grateful for that. Thank you for that. And that is close to bringing us to time. Is there anybody who's just burning to say something before we close for today? I do know that we have somebody coming in the next 5 minutes, so I don't want to step on their time. Nicola, please, we'll close with your comment.
Well, I was thinking, out of the silence of contemplative prayer, we come and we break the silence.
The way we break bread in the Eucharist, the way we break open the word at the liturgy of the word, there is that breaking open is what gets you to the core of things and allows you to be able to distribute and to spread and to nourish one another. So it's a beautiful image that, in the silence, we all carry one another throughout the week, or even in our shared meditation. And yet in the breaking open of that silence, this is what emerges. And it's a beautiful thing. Thank you for that metaphor. That might find its way into one of my opening prayers for our thing. It's a nice concept. So thank you for that. Well, thank you all again, as always, for your thoughts and questions, concerns. I'm very much looking forward to seeing you this coming Saturday. And until then, I bid you, as always, a Benum Christinet, and I send you with my blessing 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. Be safe, be loving, be transformed, and be trusting. Okay. And we'll see you all in a week. God bless you.